The ongoing quarantine is a crisis for others, but a blessing for a lone wolf like me. It's the perfect time to do some game development, as real life is unlikely to get in the way. I wanted to work on my dream game during that time. And I did, until I got demotivated and wanted to work on something smaller, something I could finish instead of just starting it. So I joined the weekly Game Jam, an event that lasts for 6 days with very loose rules. Because of this, I only had enough time to make a small game, and the time constraint gave me a motivation to finish. This video will be about the development of my Game Jam entry and the lessons I learned while making it. This Game Jam I participated in chooses a new theme as an inspiration every week. This week's theme was In the Dark. So I got to work and thought of a cool concept for a game that I could develop in 6 days. The idea I came up with was a first-person shooter with platforming mechanics. It is set in an office building at night. Each level is set on a floor of this building, and the goal is to shoot all light panels on the floor before a timer runs out. Due to the setting, I decided that the hazards that would hinder the player's progression would be things that you would find in a typical office, but with unusual behaviors. For example, office chairs and desks are constantly sliding from one place to another, bookshelves cause bookstorms every once in a while, and stairs transform into ramps. I wrote all of these ideas down in a game design document to turn them from vague and cool sounding concepts into detailed and realistic gameplay elements. This went really well, as I could rely on the experience I had gathered during the 8 game jams I had already participated in. For each game jam idea, I wrote a GDD, so I had some practice. I ended the day with a complete game design document, feeling confident that I had made good use of my time so far, and decided to go to bed as it was already 3 AM. On the second day, I immediately went into the prototyping phase to test if my ideas looked and felt good instead of just sounding cool. I used the Unreal Engine to develop my game, as it already comes with many features like a 3D level editor, proper collision detection and many rendering effects, which saved me a ton of time. All of the gameplay logic I created for the project was made in blueprints. Let me quickly explain what blueprints are. They are objects that can be placed in the game world with a certain appearance and functionality. For example, a door blueprint consists of a door frame model and a door model. The door rotates to open and close when the player stands inside of an invisible box, which is also part of the blueprint, and presses a button. You connect different nodes together inside of the blueprints to achieve the desired functionality. Each node either does something or provides other nodes with certain variables. By connecting them up using wires, you can execute them in a specific order to create very flexible behaviors. I am not going to explain in great detail how I created specific gameplay logic, as this is not meant to be a tutorial. There are plenty of those on YouTube already. Plus, you can also go to the Unreal Engine forums to get the answers for your blueprint problems. This video is a more general overview of game creation. If you want me to go more in depth on certain aspects of the process, write a comment. Anyways, I started creating the basic mechanics like the light panel blueprint, 2 blueprints for the entrance and exit elevators, which are the starting and ending points of each level, and a simple countdown timer which could be easily set and paused. With the main mechanics roughly implemented, I took a short break, which ended up being 4 hours long. I returned to start work on the different hazards the player has to avoid. The first hazard I developed was the sliding chair. It moves between 2 points and pauses whenever it reaches one of the points. If it collides with the player while it is moving, the player will be positioned on the chair and they will only be able to look 90 degrees to the left and right for 2 seconds. Afterwards, the player gets launched away from the chair and can look around freely again. The movement was the easy part. Constraining the player's ability to look around 180 degrees instead of the usual 360 was a bit more difficult, as I had never done anything like that before. But it didn't prove too much of a challenge. When I deemed the chair's functionality to be mostly complete, I moved on to the next one, the bookstorm. The bookstorm is a bookshelf which occasionally blows books away from it, pushing the player back if they get caught in the storm. This one was easy to create, as I had the knowledge necessary to create most of the different aspects of the bookstorm and, more importantly, the knowledge of how to Google for anything that I still needed to learn. The last hazard I implemented was even easier. The crawl carpet halves the player's speed whenever the player walks on it, and that's easy to create, so I quickly finished this hazard as well, and ended the day feeling confident that I had made significant progress. The first hazard I created today was almost as easy as the crawl carpet. It is an invisible box meant to alter the player's movement so it feels like they're walking on ice. The slippery floor. This box can be placed anywhere in the world where the floor should be slippery. Like the crawl carpet, it merely changes the player's movement so it was also easy to code. With that done, I created the sliding desk. It is similar to the sliding chair, also moving between two positions, but with the added ability for the player to stand on it at all times. It is also more dangerous, as it is bigger and completely stuns the player for 3 seconds if they collide. Because the sliding desk's behavior was similar to the sliding chair I had already created, I could simply copy and paste the sliding chair blueprint, saving me some time, and then just had to tweak and add the logic necessary to distinguish the desk in terms of functionality. The next hazard I implemented was the zapping computer screen. It would shoot out a lightning bolt, which would stun the player and knock them back, like the sliding desk. Unlike the sliding desk, however, if the player was stunned by the lightning bolt, all light panels that were in a certain radius around the computer screen would be reactivated again. I expected this hazard to be more difficult to create, but my lack of confidence wasn't justified and I could quickly move on to the next hazard, which did prove a challenge to implement. The ramp stairs. These stairs transform into a ramp and back every few seconds. While they are a ramp, the player cannot traverse them and slides down. The challenge when implementing the stairs mainly came from one thing. I added the ability to change the size of all the steps for each individual ramp stair. But when the size of all the steps changes, the amount that each step needs to rotate to create a smooth-looking stairs also changes. Figuring out the amount, no matter what size the steps were, proved to be a lot of documenting different values and then finding a fitting formula. The formula I ended up with was actually surprisingly simple. A breath of fresh air was that I immediately figured out how to make the player slide down the ramp, which is something I had never done before, so I expected it to take some time. After that, I decided to make my game look better, as most of the basic gameplay logic seemed to be done, which it wasn't, but we'll get back to that later. I created 3D models for all of my objects, starting with the chair. I first searched for reference images and then tried to replicate the outline of the chair on the reference images from the side and back in Blender. The end result was a simple looking but easily distinguishable chair. I then imported the model into Unreal Engine and made sure it showed up instead of the cube that I had added as a placeholder for the chair model. I repeated the process for all the other models needed and finished the day with a prettier game. I decided to focus on the sounds on that day already, as I had previously forgotten about sounds until the last day, as I always listen to music while working and don't notice that my game is absolutely quiet until the last day. Unlike the code and the 3D models, I didn't create the sounds myself, as I had no prior experience doing so. Instead, I searched the internet for the sounds needed that were free and that I could use in my game without getting sued for it. I then had to import the sound files into the engine and make sure that they played at the right time, the right location, and, most importantly, the right volume. Because I had little experience with this process compared to implementing 3D models, I ended up removing a few sounds because I couldn't get them to sound good in-game. I got the sound effects from various websites, but the music I downloaded exclusively from purpleplanet.com, just like the background music in this video. Then I created a few particles for my game. A lightning bolt for the zapping computer screen, and a sort of muzzle flash that shows up whenever the player's gun is fired. While I had created some simple particles before, I wasn't exactly familiar with the process. Luckily, a YouTube tutorial came to my rescue, which showed me exactly how to create a cool looking lightning particle effect that even lights up the world around it. After some initial troubles with Unreal's particle system, I eventually ended up with a cool looking particle effect and an acceptable looking muzzle flash, although the flash part of it is missing. With the game looking even prettier, I went to bed, ready to design the levels tomorrow. But before I could create the levels, I needed to add flying book particles for my book storm to make it look cool, and so the storm was actually a book storm. In addition to that, I increased the difficulty of the hazards and then started designing the tutorial levels. My goal was to introduce the player to the game's rules without using text boxes. Instead, by designing the first levels in a certain way, I wanted them to figure out the game's rules by themselves. Thus, the first level is an empty room with a single light panel as the only source of light, which draws the player's attention. With the gun at the bottom right of the screen and a reactive crosshair which grows in size when the player is aiming at a light panel, I was sure most players would be able to figure out what to do. A generous timer of 30 seconds lessens the stress of learning as well. Once the light panel is shot, the exit elevator opens, now being the new source of light, and invites the player to enter it in order to progress. To check whether or not I had accomplished my goal, I let my brother test the 3 tutorial levels I had created. He managed to do it fairly easily and even praised the game a little bit. But during the rest of the level design process, I ran into some bugs. Initially, I wanted to record an hour of level creation, but instead spent 40 minutes fixing bugs and adding features that I didn't realize were still missing from the game. This led to me getting frustrated and only managing to create 4 levels instead of the 21 that I planned, putting me just a teeny weeny bit behind my planned schedule. My plan had originally been to create all of them in one day and polish them on the next. To finish all of them, I now needed to shift into maximum overdrive. To compensate for my lack of progress, I created a beat chart. This table helps me to introduce new hazards at a good pace and ensure that there are no difficulty spikes. With the beat chart done and the lasting feeling of failure, I went to bed. This day was a day of compromises. For example, the amount of planned levels went down from 21 to 16 to reduce the amount of work that still needed to be done. At this point, blueprints that had previously worked suddenly broke and didn't function correctly for no apparent reason. The sliding chair, for instance, would teleport me instead of just launching me forwards as it did before. Not only were blueprints breaking, but their missing features became apparent. I never even stopped the player from just walking around the world while they were sitting on the chair, something that I initially planned, but simply forgot to test in-game. I realized that for all the blueprint troubles, I only had myself to blame, which made the situation even more frustrating. By the time 9 PM rolled around, I still hadn't designed half of the levels. I decided to scrap slippery floors entirely, because to indicate where a slippery floor would be, I would have needed to make specific surfaces reflective, which would be even more work. I was running out of time. I wasn't able to think and type clearly anymore. Due to the self-induced stress, I feared that there might even be problems with publishing the game for others to play at the last minute. Then, I decided to give up. I shut down my computer and went to relax for the rest of the day. I thought I might be frustrated and angry at myself for failing to finish the game, but, to my surprise, I felt proud for once. Let me explain. I had joined the jam to finish a game project instead of just starting one. I had been doing all of this for myself, not for others. And the best thing to do for myself at this moment was just to let it go and to recover physically and mentally. I learned the hard way that even a project which only takes 6 days to finish cannot be planned from the beginning to the end, as complications always arise during development. So I set my sights on making a game in 4 days for the next weekly game jam, because I actually felt motivated by my failure and wanted to do better next time. Looking back, I should have started designing the levels sooner, as the environment that I tested all the gameplay mechanics in was brightly lit and open, as opposed to the small and dark corridors of the final levels. I also realized that I could have just submitted the small prototype I had, as this was allowed by the jam rules. Looking at the Game Jam page also made me smile because it said to create a game or a prototype in a week, stress-free, which is exactly the opposite of what I did. I was just too hard on myself, I figured. Not being too hard on yourself for your failures is an advice I heard many times before, but only now was I starting to take it. Looking back on my programming achievements, I realized that they were actually quite impressive, given that I am completely self-taught. I discovered the Unreal Engine on my own and learned everything about it without anyone else motivating me or forcing me to do so. After 2 years, I still haven't given up, even though the engine is complex and difficult to master. After some introspection, I waited a day for the next weekly game jam to start, eager to succeed this time around.